Hello and welcome to the Auditing Antics podcast. So, today, Michelle and I are going to be tackling some different questions that have come in over the past couple of months, some things that I know even my members have been curious about and asking a lot of questions about. Before we start with that, though, I just want to give a little update. So, this week, I can't believe that time has gone this fast, but this week is my 1 year anniversary for Stephanie Allard Consulting. So, as a part of that, currently on the Etsy, or I should say in the Etsy shop, there's 20% off of all of the products there. I've got some fun Christmas designs in there. It's just been a nice way to have an outlet for some design and things like that that I enjoy doing, as if we have all this free time, right?
I know, right? Like I was telling you last night, I like to do those myrtles in my free time.
Yes, exactly. Yes, a little bit
So,
of a
hey,
brain break. Yeah.
everybody likes something different.
Yeah. And the one other thing as well, so the membership is also 20% off this week and no code is needed or anything like that. So if you've been thinking about that, check it out. The membership, it is good on the renewals too, whether you do monthly or annual. So check that out and we'd be happy to have you join us there. All right. So Michelle, why don't you go ahead and jump in with our first question?
Okay, so I find our first question very interesting. It says, can the nurse in our office complete an AWV and bill for that on their own as long as the provider is reviewing and the documentation and signing off on the record?
So, sadly, that's the workflow we see a lot of times,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a
Is.
lot of misunderstanding and misinformation being spread about these. So, AWV, we're talking about the annual wellness visits for Medicare patients and some of the Medicare Advantage plans as well. And, one of the things with that is we have to remember that, yes, it's more of an evaluation or an assessment with that patient from, like a questionnaire type standpoint. And we can have someone helping with the intake of that information, but a
Mm-hmm.
provider still has to be involved because the point of that is that they are coming in, they're reviewing the responses to what was collected from the patient, and then they're determining number one, what's appropriate for that patient based on covered preventative services. So, a lot of times they may need to go to that website. I find a lot of providers don't even know about that website, which is interesting. But, we can go to CMS into their preventative services and look at everything they'll cover. It'll show things like age, frequency, diagnosis. So that's a large part of this wellness visit is making sure
Mm-hmm.
the patient has access and is being offered covered services that are there to help with prevention. Now, another component, which I know this can be difficult as well, is the fact that their existing conditions come into play here too.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is where we have misunderstanding with AWV when people think, oh, we can just split bill, they address the chronic conditions.
Yeah.
But no, that's not the way that that works. So, as a part of the annual wellness visit, we're looking at the provider's perspective on the stability, the severity of the conditions. And then, as a part of that, if there are, refills sent in or routine labs that are used to monitor those conditions, that's all considered to be a part of the AWV. So, in that description, I hope that the listeners are hearing here that that's not the work of a nurse. The
No, it's
intake
not.
is the work of the nurse. But,
Yes.
formulating a care plan for that patient, looking and ordering the proper things that are there to help patients, that is all supposed to be the work of a physician or an
Mhm.
APP practitioner.
It's still essentially the development of a treatment plan,
Mhm.
just not in the sense that they're maybe treating something specific. They're setting up a game plan for that patient. And the way that I like to describe these types of visits is they're more hands off. They're not intended to be like what's going on right now. It's or like a problem visit. It's intended to keep the patient's future in mind, to try to anticipate
Mhm.
things that may come up in the future. And just as you said, reviewing stability of chronic conditions and things like that is a component of that. One workflow that I have seen a lot of recently, which has caused a lot of incorrect split billing, is where they have the nurse complete the questionnaire component, and then the provider comes in and they document more of like a problem visit note, but then also that preventive stuff is weaved in there, and then they think, oh great, because we have these two separate things, I can now bill this E&M. But when you look at it at the end of the day, all it is the work of the annual wellness visit. So just
Mhm.
because you have two different notes and you have two different people doing these things, understand that just because that's your workflow does not mean that you can bill separately for those things.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
can't get
Yeah,
around it.
because
You can't get around it.
right. Yeah, I've seen that some practices think that when the physician or APP practitioner comes in, that becomes that separate problem visit.
Yeah,
It's like,
no.
no, they have responsibilities as a part of the annual wellness. But it's tricky because when you look up specifics about it, you do have language there that, the clinical staff, the nursing staff can come in and help with that intake, but that's all it is. It's that intake of
Yeah,
information. They cannot complete an entire wellness visit on their own.
no, they cannot. All right, shall we move on to our second question?
Yep.
Okay, so this one actually is kind of a hot topic right now. It says, I recently heard about some updates related to RPM, so remote
Remote.
patient monitoring, if I can talk. So, remote patient monitoring. And there are components of those services I was not aware of previously. What should we be looking for to be sure our outsourced RPM company is compliant? So this is interesting because this is often a component that we see where these services are being outsourced and then nobody's looking at it.
Mhm.
And so first part of the question is, what should we be looking for to be sure our outsourced RPM company is compliant? And how do we make sure the work is all taking place onshore and not outsourced? So these are, I would say, the two biggest issues that we come across when it comes to compliance and RPM. So I'll
Mhm.
let you take that.
Okay. So one of the things that I've seen in the industry is that because there's, decreases in reimbursement, but there's rising costs, practices are looking to implement new services to have additional revenue coming in. But as they want to implement a service, they also have to gauge, the return and what that's going to cost to do that. And there's companies out there that will provide RPM services, but you have to be really careful to ask very specific questions to vet these organizations. And, one of the things that I find is that when providers are in trouble in this space, it's because they were approached essentially by a salesperson or a CEO of a company, and they didn't even know what RPM was to begin with. They're
Hmm.
just told, hey, we can do all of this for you, and it's X amount of dollars extra into your practice each month or whatever the time frame is. So at a base level, when you are vetting these organizations, first of all, if you want to do this type of service, it's going to be more beneficial to look internally, look at different software that's available,
Hmm.
and look at how you can potentially do that. If you don't have that capacity, maybe you're a smaller practice, you don't want to bring on the extra expense of additional staff or burden your current staff, there's definitely options out there. But you have to make sure that you are really digging in and finding out that onshore offshore component. So one of the places that I see that is very deficient with RPM is when we have issues with documentation, but you drill down and you look and the company is being run offshore. And
Mhm.
something that a lot of people also don't recognize or realize is the fact that if you are billing services, especially to government payers, they have to be performed on US soil. So if you are being told, oh, we have medical assistants, we have nurses that work for us, they do all of our monitoring, all of these things, but yet those people are over there and they try to say, well, we have a server based in the US, or, the documents aren't technically opened in the US, we remote into a desktop, things like that. No, absolutely not. You have to know that the work that you are billing, especially Medicare for, is in the US. That number one is a huge issue. I was researching RPM companies. I have a client I'm currently helping with an issue right now. And some of the red flags that I find when I research this is the companies, a lot of them you won't know who it is you're working with. So what I
Mhm.
mean by that is you'll go to their about page. There's no individualized information. You have no idea who owns that company, who's running that company. But then all of a sudden, in their advertising on the homepage, they say, oh, we have over 2,500 employees. Or, like a very high number, something
Yeah.
that seems very unrealistic. And then, I'll ask my client, well, how much do you pay for that? What is your return? They don't really look at it as, oh, I'm paying for this because they're bringing them extra revenue, which is another sales tactic.
Mhm.
But, when we look at it, it shows all these red flags for those of us in the industry that do know what to look for. It shows us that the work's probably being done offshore, which is a huge issue. Now, another problem is the access to the information. RPM software is great. I love when I work with clients and they're using RPM software
Mhm.
because it's designed specifically to, capture everything that's needed. But is that available to you? Are they integrating it into your EMR? With my particular client, there was supposed to be a workflow in place where those documents are getting uploaded. The company hasn't been uploading them. So everything sounds great from a sales perspective, but then it starts and the workflow's not going, but revenue's coming in, things are busy, not really paying attention, and then you end up with a problem. The
And how often would you say, Stephanie, when you have clients that are in trouble with their RPM, how often would you say part of the sales pitch was that it's hands off, passive income
oh
essentially
yeah,
for the
every time,
practice?
every
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, that's just out of curiosity, because it seems like that's how they capture the attention of practices.
Yes, yeah. And we have to remember if you're getting reimbursed for something, there's a cost, there's a time component to that. There's nothing that comes from zero, from a
Mhm.
time perspective. So even if you're outsourcing some of the monitoring, for example, that physician or whoever the provider is responsible to be talking to the patient to make sure that their notes are showing that the conditions that are being monitored impact their care. That's another thing I'm seeing. There's a lot of people approaching specialists, and the specialists are focusing on one organ system. So the question then becomes, okay, if you're not their PCP, or if it's not clear in the note how all of these other things impact your decision, why was RPM appropriate for your patient through your
Mhm.
practice? And
Yeah.
that goes into consent as well. I'm finding that a lot of the companies say, oh, we'll get the consent for you. But then we have that disconnect where we don't have documentation, again, showing that this is something that the provider feels is clinically indicated and that they order for the patient. So there's, I, there's a lot of negatives to it. I do want to say there are companies that do it correctly,
Mhm.
but the majority of them do not, and you have to be aware, and you've got to be asking these questions and having them follow it up. You need to know what that documentation looks like. And I've had situations too where the names, appear to be offshore. I ask for licensing. They can't provide me any kind of licensing, and it all goes downhill from there. So
And
it's a tricky situation.
how does that work when there's actually like obviously the point of remote patient monitoring is to make sure that the patient's remaining stable. So one big one that I could think of is like fluctuations in weight, like say it's a congestive heart failure patient and all of a sudden there's a big jump in weight. To me, that would prompt something from the provider that, this. So is that the workflow of these companies? Like, are they supposed to be reaching out to the provider and saying, this patient has had a big change. We need to take a look at this and see if there needs to be any changes to the treatments or things like that. Is that how that workflow is expected to
Mhm.
work and works? Or do these companies have people that reach out to the patient? Like, I guess,
Well, here's the problem. Number one, that is how it's supposed to work. Number two, the companies that are not compliant, not ethical companies, what they will do is they want to do something at a bare minimum level. So something could potentially be going on, but the provider, maybe they haven't even seen the patient in over a year or looked at their record, but yet they're being followed for RPM. So the
mhm,
question is, okay, what are they getting out of that? Medical necessity could be questioned then.
yeah,
Now, another big issue, and not everyone realizes that signs up for this. Remember, with remote patient monitoring, the device is expected to be automated, meaning that it electronically submits information over.
mhm,
So if you have a nurse who's going into a nursing home and or even worse, the facility nurse is manually taking vitals on a patient and then they send that information to you, okay, no, that's not what this is intended to be. I've even had situations where they'll provide the patient with some kind of device that can measure some kind of, vital or something like that, and they'll call the patient and say, "Oh, did you do your vitals? Oh, what was the blood pressure? What was your vital?"
oh
So
man,
that is not the intent. This all came about during COVID when there was restrictions on being able to see patients. They wanted to make sure that there was more availability from the perspective of monitoring that patient and their potential decline. And it's
mhm,
turned into this whole big thing where everyone started companies and, they want to have dirt cheap labor involved so they can make more money and, sell their products. And again, I'm speaking to the ones that are not compliant and not ethical.
yeah,
But if you don't know these things, they're all going to look the same to you if you start researching to see who you want to
mhm,
work with. So you have to be careful. You need to know who their clinical staff is, where they're located, if there's offshore work, what are they actually doing? And you need to ask that because a lot of companies are starting to hide that that's a part of their internal workflow.
uh-huh. Wow. That's just it it's crazy. It almost makes me wonder, like, how do you know, you know?
You don't, and that's why there's so many, issues around fraud in that particular area because,
Yeah,
we have someone who says, "Oh, surgeons need their patients to be at a certain weight, so let's send all of their patients a scale and let's have the patients weigh themselves and be on an RPM program to see if they're, appropriate for surgery." That is not the intent, and that's how far these companies have gone to twist things just to have a
wow.
service that they think is billable.
Yeah, that's crazy. So, moral of the story here, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is.
Yep.
And if you've signed up for this and you're not having any type of involvement, that's probably a red flag that you need to take a look at that ASAP.
Yeah, reach out for an audit now. If you are very hands
Yeah.
off, That's, something I can definitely help with, but those records need to be audited and the work of that company needs to be audited.
Because at the end of the day, Stephanie, what liability does that company have? It's all on the provider. The liability is on the provider. So they can sell these services, meaning the companies who are not ethical and are not doing things in a compliant way. So they can sell these services and essentially have no liability at the end of the
Well,
day. Or is there liability?
I would say in this situation, and again, I'm not legal, it's just what I see in the
True.
work that
Yeah.
I do, but that is a lot easier to pinpoint their issues, I think, because
Okay.
they are actively doing work. Where it's hard is if you have a supplier who sells something and then
Okay.
they just sell you a product and they're gone. That's a lot harder there. These situations with RPM, it's ongoing, consistent work. So a lot of the liability, yes, is on the provider because they've sent the claim out and they're getting paid. Because the way that these work is a lot of times they say, okay, we're not going to charge you per patient, maybe. You give us this percentage back of what you receive on the claim. So there's different ways that that's done as well. But because of the ongoing nature, there's more that could be looked at. But if that company is being looked at, then the provider is going to have an issue as well.
Hmm. All right. Let's move on to our next
Okay.
question. And this is kind of a very broad question, but also a very hot topic right now. It says, now that the government has reopened, are telehealth services allowed to continue going forward?
So I'll summarize this one pretty quickly. So where we're at right now, all of those waivers that expired at the end of September that we were worried about, those are back on, but only to January 30th. So when
Okay.
everyone freaked out because the government actually shut down and it actually stayed shut down for an extended period of time, and then you had to deal with, businesses fully operating through telehealth or very large schedules you did nothing with because you didn't think it was going to happen. Um, I've heard of companies that are continuing to bill as if the patient is in the office so they don't miss revenue. Don't do that. That's a huge issue. And if you're
Oh.
audited, that's going to be obvious, but do not do that. But right now where we're at is this is all still temporary. We're still in a holding pattern. So, yes, we have to January 30th, but now we have to wait and see. We do not know what this is going to look like permanently. So, I highly suggest you still are having all of the conversations as if
Hmm.
this all goes away permanently as of February 1st, because the changes are not something that you flip a switch and then, oh, I turned telehealth off. We don't do it anymore. There's a lot
Yeah.
of factors, and a lot of people weren't taking it seriously as we were having conversations, in the summer leading up to the end of September. So let's learn from that,
Hmm.
plan for it, make sure you have a plan B, a plan C, and, don't be caught off guard.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if you were panicking about this that the government shut down, now is not the time to be like, "Oh, phew, we dodged a bullet." Now's the time to plan.
Yeah.
Plan for when January 30th comes up, because guess what? At that point, it's not an emergency, just like Christmas is not an emergency.
Yes.
Certain things happen. We know
Yeah.
about this is coming up. So if you were one of those people who were having a panic moment because the government shut down, don't just relax now. Make a plan, because
Mhm.
even if it comes out that, oh, these are going to be made permanent, wouldn't it be better to be prepared for the worst case scenario? I mean, even just from
Yes.
your patient's perspective, there's patients that probably rely on the availability of those telehealth
Yeah,
services.
yeah.
So
Mhm.
if you're a patient, prepare yourself to have to go into the office to be seen, and because there is a flip side to that as well. And also know what your payer's rules are, because I think that's something we don't think about very often, is how the patient is impacted
Mhm.
in this, like from their perspective. And if they have a telehealth service, what could that mean for them
Right.
if those flexibilities aren't in place?
Yeah.
All right, so we have three more questions
Okay.
to go through, and in looking here, they kind of all seem to be E&M related.
Okay.
So for the first question, what rules apply when coding from templates, macros, or copy and paste documentation? And it, today it's kind of funny that this question comes up, because I was working on an audit just this morning where all sorts of, like, just an assessment and plan that is 5 paragraphs long because of your template or your macro that you've used.
Yeah. Well, and a
Right.
lot of times too, EMR systems can do that.
Uh-huh.
We've got EMRs out there where it's their goal, modernizing medicine, for example. It's their goal to put so much stuff into a macro, and it can hurt the record. If we don't, it
Yeah.
doesn't matter that you gave me 5 sentences about ibuprofen if I
Yeah.
still don't fully understand what the provider was thinking.
Yeah.
So,
Literally, in these notes that I was looking at, they were 5 paragraphs long, every single one, and
mhm,
it was very canned information surrounding what the patient presented for, and then
mhm,
at the bottom, in literally one sentence, the provider documented what the plan was.
yeah.
And oftentimes I was having to downcode these
Mhm.
encounters, and I think they have this, I mean, we don't always know the thought process of a provider, but these grand, long, you know, paragraphs about the patient's condition did not show severity in any
Or
way. It did
or
not
we'll see
show.
this patient was moderately complex for XYZ. No, that
Yeah,
doesn't make it
no, this
moderate
is still
complexity.
at the end of the day, an acute, uncomplicated problem.
Mhm,
And so I think when it comes to coding from things like templates and macros, copy and paste is a whole other beast that I would not put in there with templates and macros. So what I like to say is, yes, they are allowed. Macros and templates are allowed. But what they are not intended to do is replace entire sections of your documentation.
mhm.
You need to make sure that your templates and macros are relevant to your patients, because how many times, Stephanie, have we seen these be used, and like we look in there and some random information is in there that's not even relevant to this
Or
patient
the wrong
encounter.
gender
Yeah.
or things like that.
Yes. My favorite are the ones that say "and or." I was working one and they were wanting to bill for independent interpretation, and it said, the X-ray results and or interpretation." Like, they were trying to, I can't remember the exact wording, but they were putting this macro statement in there to try to make it look like they had independently interpreted this test. And
Mhm.
they probably did. However, their documentation, well, it's like, and or, which one is it? Because I could go with or.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like, what did that help you? This did not help you. So make sure that it is relevant to the encounter. If you are a provider who is documenting using macros and templates, you have to review them.
Mhm.
You can't put a statement at the bottom that you did your best, you know, to
Yeah.
make sure it was all accurate like we have seen. You have to actually review it and remove what is not relevant, because nothing invalidates a note quicker than documentation that comes out of left field,
Yeah.
um, or documentation that starts to look the same every time you're
Yeah,
reviewing the
patient to
provider's
patient,
notes. Yes,
visit to visit. Yeah.
I had one like that in pulmonary where they were like, if the patient has COPD, do this. If the patient has asthma, do this. If the patient, and they were literally listing all of the different types of conditions that the patient may have. And it's like, so what did you actually do today?
I know.
Because I'm not sure, so I think that's what's the most important when you're coding from things like templates and macros. And it is a little bit different, I think, how coders review things, Stephanie, versus how an auditor reviews
Mhm.
things. Um, so if you're seeing patterns, if you're coding and you're seeing patterns, just make it aware. Communicate what you're seeing, because I think a lot of times there is a breakdown in communication in what's being seen from a coding perspective, because how often is the quantity of what they're able to get coded
Right,
emphasized,
right.
and we want quality as well, and you're the ones who are seeing it, so how can an educator know they need to educate if they're not aware this pattern exists? So make sure that you as the coder are communicating these things, and you as the auditor, you're taking that next step and comparing things and identifying those patterns and seeing how it's affecting the validity of what's
Mhm.
being documented.
Yep.
And I always like to bring up that CMS table document that they have. They go over templates, they go over macros, they go over copy and paste, and they actually spell out what they expect to see, which is kind of a rarity. Um,
Mhm.
so, if you just Google CMS decision table, they will bring up that document for you to review.
Mhm.
So the next one, and I'm assuming this has to do with crediting data analyzed. Does a query through the EHR support discussion of management of the patient, or does it need to be real-time communication?
So here's one of the things that needs to be, remember, communication or a discussion, if we look at the word
Mhm.
discussion more specifically, that's a back and forth.
Mhm.
So we need to have that back and forth. And if it is like, oh, I emailed them today and they responded to me in 5 days in the future, that's not really showing that real-time discussion with another healthcare professional in order to be able to account for that. So
Mhm.
I don't look at one-way transmission of information that could or could not be responded to. So voicemails, messages, emails, sometimes they will text somebody. That type of thing is a one-way transmission, and we don't know what happens after. So we
Mhm.
have to see the back and forth discussion in order to be able to give credit for that.
Yeah, so I'm gonna take that one step further, and just saying that you had a discussion
Mhm.
isn't really enough. You need to tell us what was discussed. And because I see a lot, especially with data. Oh, I see a lot where providers just want to say, I reviewed all available tests. And it's like, well, I see this patient has documentation in here going all the way back to 2004. Does that mean you have reviewed all of that? Like, holy cow. No wonder you're short on time. So make sure that whenever you're crediting things like discussion of management, there's something meaningful there, I
Mhm.
guess would be the word that I'm looking for. And relevant. Once again, I think relevant comes up a lot, relevant to the patient's situation. When crediting this discussion of management, because just saying you discussed it with somebody, okay, what did you discuss and what was the outcome of that discussion? Because we have to show why it was needed,
Mhm.
not just that it was done.
Yeah. Yep, I agree.
Okay. And then the next one, also data related. How do you count data when multiple tests are ordered and reviewed during the encounter?
So if we go back to the basics, Remember that now in the guidelines it states that we get credit for one or the other, so the order or the review. And if the order is stemming from a face to face encounter, that needs to go towards the order. You cannot save it for the review. So for me, when I'm doing my auditing work, let's be honest, we usually don't get enough detail from the provider to know if they're reviewing something that was, from a prior date that, was a telephone order or whatever it may be. We don't
Mhm.
know all of that context because they're not documenting it for us. So I'm typically looking for the orders that are happening during that encounter. If I have some context to testing being done externally that they're looking at, and I can see references to, when I teach this, I refer to it as an identifier, a time identifier. So we know when it happened, we know where it's coming from. Again, very rare, but those instances more so in a new patient visit is where I can see that. If that's present, then yes, we'll go ahead and give credit for a review. But on a large scale, typically we're not looking to give credit for the review due to lack of detail or the scenario doesn't fit what we're allowed to account for.
Yeah, typically when I am crediting review, some additional research is necessary, honestly. I have to go back, and once again, this might be the difference between a coder workflow and an auditor workflow, but I will, when available, go back to those other encounters. And what I find, I would say probably about 99% of the time, is the provider has either ordered that test at their previous encounter, so that's when they received the data analyzed credit, or they have billed for the interpretation of that test,
Mhm.
or it's documented as reviewed at the previous encounter.
Yes, yeah. That language keeps coming forward.
Uh,
Yeah.
so a lot of times for me, the review never seems to be supported.
Mhm.
And you do have to kind of rely or go to the orders that are taking place during that encounter. But it's not really data, unfortunately, is something that requires a little bit of research to make sure that we're crediting appropriately, because sometimes that data analyzed, which providers 100% should be credited for the work that they're doing. But that data analyzed could mean the difference between a level of service.
Mhm.
And if we're crediting them incorrectly for that data analyzed because of something they've reviewed, then we're overcoding that encounter. And that is a problem. So we have to make sure that that review is essentially truly
Mhm.
supported in that category. And I don't know about you, but I find that the review is rarely supported unless they, like you said, it's a new patient where they're, reviewing a workup that's done thus far. Another thing that I see a lot, this is data related, Stephanie, is the review of documentation.
Mhm.
So that's kind of like the
Like a
discussion of
statement, like
management. Yes.
a broad statement that they've reviewed
Yes. A
documentation, yeah.
broad statement, and
I
it's
just
like,
ignore that because there's
so
no
do
way to
I.
pinpoint where that came from.
Yeah, what did you review? Why did you need to review it? Um, I think that for me is the biggest, is why did you have to do that review? And how did it impact your treatment decisions today? I think a lot of times that last part is not communicated. And when I find in auditing where there's a disconnect in what the client would have credited in data and what I'm crediting in data, is because I'm not seeing why this review was needed today.
Right.
Um, as we know, templates, a lot of templates have that section where it's going to blow in the last set of imaging and labs
Results, really, yeah.
results.
Yeah.
Yes. And you cannot just assume that that was reviewed because it's there, or that that information was used because it's there. The provider needs to tell us that
Mhm.
that information was used or reviewed and had impact on their care of the of the patient today.
Yeah.
So data analyzed is definitely something that becomes a tangled web, and honestly is not my favorite element of medical
Yeah, I
decision
don't like
making.
it.
So if I can support it some way else, I'm going to. But some people do put a lot of weight. Some specialties, I would say, do have to put more weight on that data analyzed section just because of the nature of what they do. So make
Yeah.
sure you understand that and read the definitions. That would be my biggest suggestion if you struggle with data analyzed. Read the definitions within the E&M guidelines, and I thought that was extremely helpful.
Mhm. Yep. Yep, I agree. I always call that my column of last resort. I do not like
Mhm.
column 2.
Me neither. I don't like it either, and it's like, oh, why? Why did you need to do this today? You have extensive data review, but a low complexity presenting problem. Why?
Mhm.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, why?
Exactly. All right. Well, that was a good episode. I know there's a lot that goes on, and even when I see certain topics brought up often in the industry or on LinkedIn and things like that, there's so many viewpoints to it and it still differs depending on what you see in a note. So, it's always
Mhm,
good to make sure that we understand what we're doing so we can apply that correctly.
mhm,
All right. So we will end there for today. And next week, we're going to have our Thanksgiving episode. So I hope you will all join in and also be thinking about what it is that you're thankful for this year. Goodbye, and we'll see you next week.